Okay, so now that we are a little bit more familiar with widget blueprints for creating UI, the next thing I want to look at is creating a game over screen. Because currently, if we playtest our game and we die, we just instantly respawn back at the start. Now, that's totally fine and it makes the game functional, but before we respawn at the start, I want to add some sort of screen that tells the player that they've hit game over, that they've died, and asks them if they want to restart the game or exit. So let's look at how we would go about creating something like that. So we are going to use Widget Blueprint again for this system. And I'm going to create a new Widget Blueprint here next to our UI underscore HUD. So let's go ahead and right click, and under user interface, we're going to create a widget blueprint, and we're going to use the user widget template. We're going to name this UI underscore game over. Okay, so let's double click to open this up, and you'll see that we have the same widget blueprint editor that we did for the health bar. So the first step in creating a new widget is to add a canvas panel. So I'm just going to search it here and drop it under my UI underscore game over, which will then show me the bounds of my screen. So I do want this to fill up the entire screen, so this is exactly what I want. But in order for anything to appear on the canvas, we need to add some more components to it. So I'm going to clear my search. And under this common elements drop down here, I'm going to grab an image, and I'm going to just drag and drop that under the canvas panel. This will give you this little blank white image in the top left hand corner of your canvas. So I want this to fill the entire screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on it, and that of course will give you the option to resize it manually, as well as where to anchor it, but there is a quicker way to do this, and that is by using this anchors drop down in the details panel. So normally when you click on this, this will change the anchor point for your widget. And if I did not properly explain what anchor points do, I do want to take a quick minute to demonstrate what they do. So as I said in the previous video, anchor points are used for determining how a 2D UI element is scaled when handling screens of different resolution. So a really quick way to demonstrate what this is doing is just to come into our level and hit play, and pay attention to the health bar up here in the top left corner of the screen as I resize my my screen here. By dragging the content browser up and down, you'll see that it is scaling this appropriately according to the resolution here, and how this is handled is determined, of course, by this anchor point. So just a quick review of that is what an anchor point does. So normally when you select here at this anchor point drop down and you make your selections, it will move the anchor point. However, if you read down here at the bottom of the drop down, it says if you can hold control to update the position to match. So if I come into this anchors and I select this full screen here and hold control, that will instantly scale my entire image to the size of the viewport canvas. So that's a little bit of a shortcut for you there. Okay, so I have my image scaled, but right now it is completely white, which is not what I want. So let's do a little bit of design work here. I'm going to pull open my details panel here, and I'm just going to rename this background. It's just to keep things a little bit more clear when you have things with the auto-generated names. If you have a lot of them, sometimes it becomes difficult to tell what piece you're actually working with. So I'm going to change the color here to black, actually, and I'm going to change the opacity of this image to, I think, around 0.5. So I'm going to come down here to this A field. A is for alpha, which controls the opacity of images in digital art. So I'm going to change it from 1, which means full opacity, to 0.5, which means half opacity. And I'm just going to hit OK. Okay, so before I design this any further, I want to test it out to see how it looks in the viewport. So I'm going to hit compile and save just to save the progress that we've made so far. And back in my content browser, I'm going to open my third person character by double clicking. Now, if you recall, we added our health bar UI, our heads up display, at begin play by using these two nodes here, the create widget and the add to viewport node. Now, we're going to be using these same nodes here to add our game over screen. So let's just hit Control D and duplicate them. And we're going to change the class from UI head to UI game over. Okay, but we obviously don't want it to start at begin play because that would mean that we start our game with a game over screen. So just for the purposes of testing this, why don't we bind it to a key press? So I'm going to right click and type in Q key and pull up the Q key and connect it here. Okay, let's compile and save. And let's test out what the screen looks like in game. So let's hit play and let's press Q, and that will give you a preview of your UI. You just see it darkens the screen by about 50% by adding that black semi-transparent image over it. There is sort of an issue here with this here, is that if you continue to press Q, it will add them indefinitely. So you can add a Boolean toggle to prevent these multiple additions for things like this. In this case, it's not incredibly necessary because we're not obviously going to have this bound to a key here, but the way that you would use a Boolean to prevent something like that from happening, let's say you were working on an inventory screen and you wanted to, when you pressed I on the keyboard, pull up an inventory. Well, you could do it this way, and then the way you would prevent multiple additions is just to create a Boolean value with something like, name it something meaningful, based on whatever your, based on whatever it is you're trying to add. So when we press it, we want to set it to true. However, before we evaluate that, we want to make sure that it only does this if this condition is false to begin with. So when you compile new Boolean variables, they are always defaulted to false. So it should run through once and set to true. And so now if we press Q multiple times, you can see we can only bring it up once. And then you could further expand this functionality by off of the true, you would set it, then you would use this same node here, set to false, and then you would, hide your widget with some nodes for that right there. So that is how you would make a sort of a toggle screen. But I digress a little bit. That is not actually what we're going to do with this. I just wanted to show you a little bit more robust functionality if you needed it in the future. Okay, so this is our debug right here. Okay, so now that we can visualize this in the viewport by pressing Q when we're in game, we can finish our design portion. So I'm going to keep this very simple. Obviously, you can add things like fonts and different types of background images for your final game. But this being a prototype, we're just going to use the default, font and things like that that are available to us in Unreal from the get-go. So I want some text right here that tells the player that the game is over. So to do that, all we have to do is grab this text element here from the palette and drag it onto our background image. Oops. Okay, we're going to drag it onto our canvas panel, excuse me. And before I start moving this around, you may notice that when you try to move things around, you might end up accidentally grabbing your background image and moving it in a way that you did not intend. So to prevent any editing of any individual element, we're going to come over here to the background image and we're just going to hit the lock. And that will just allow us to more freely move this image around without affecting the background image underneath it. So I want this to be anchored in the center. I just hit Control there to move both things. However, you'll see that it moved my text block. It moved it based off of this point. It placed this point in the center, which is not exactly what I wanted. So to change the actual text that appears here, all we have to do is come over to this content drop down in the details panel. And here in this input field that says text block, we're just going to write game over. So I want to justify it into the center, and I'm going to increase the size of the font by expanding this font drop down here. And this is where you get all the settings for like fonts and typeface if you have those things imported. I'm just going to change this to 200 looks pretty good. And I just want to scale this so it encompasses all the text so we don't get any weird scaling issues. Okay, so great, we have this. I'm going to name it here because we're going to have a few different text objects on this screen. So I just want to be really clear when I'm looking at my hierarchy what piece is what. Okay, so we have our game over. Let's add another text element here to our canvas. And of course, it's going to add it in the top left. Let's change it to the center by holding Control and clicking on the center anchor point here. And same thing, I want this justified in the center. I want the size of the font to be smaller than the game over, maybe like 100. And I'm just going to position this, just doing this by eye. You can also change the positions up here if you want them to be very exact. You can change them numerically with these position and these size sliders up in the corner here, but I'm just going to eyeball it. Let's change the text itself to say restart. And I'm just going to change the name. Okay, and there's one more piece of text that we need right here, so let's drag out one more text element, and I want it in the center. Actually, I think I want the anchor point to be right here, so let's Control and click there and drag it approximately where we want it. And I'm just going to have a y_n to indicate to the player that pressing the Y key or the N key, pressing the Y will cause the game to restart, pressing the N will cause the game to exit out. Okay, so this is going to be our game over screen. It is not exactly a thing of beauty, but it is functional, and at this point we are still in our prototyping phase. So even your player system, or excuse me, even your player feedback systems should be placeholders at this point. Just to make sure that the functionality is all working. So let's see how this looks in our game. If we press play, we hit Q, we have this game over screen. We can still control our character, which is an issue, but, and at this point there's no real functionality because if I die, well, it's still just gonna respawn. We haven't actually told Unreal to use this widget in any meaningful way. So let's address that now. So obviously we want this screen to pop up when the player dies. So let's look at our player death system, which we can find very easily because we were good about it and organized it into a comment so we know exactly where it is. Okay. I actually am going to use this Boolean I made. I'm just going to shorten the name a little bit. So right now, when our player dies, all we're doing is reopening the level, but we want to hit this screen first. So let's drag down this code that we wrote. There's no sense in rewriting it. And let's delete the Q key from the trigger here, or from the code, I should say. And I'm just going to drag out this and drag out this to make some space in the middle. So we know that before we open the level, we want to hit this code first. So let's drag this and drag this. Now, at this point, essentially nothing will happen because we're not pausing in any way to ask for the player's input. So it will basically, these things are happening so fast that it's creating this, adding it to the viewport, and then reopening the level without this added to the level. So we're not even going to see it at this point. And that is what we need this Boolean for here. So let's just disconnect this altogether for the time being. And what happens if I do that is basically player death will cause, oops, how strange. Oh, of course. So this is not a bug per se, but just sort of a design flaw. We are not handling the player death by pitfall in the third-person character blueprint. It's in the level blueprint. So let's disconnect this one for the time being as well, and we'll come back to it. And actually, in order to test this properly, what I'm going to do is delete my player start, and I'm going to place it over here by these fire obstacles, because we're first going to address the player death in the game over screen here, and then we'll come in here and fix this issue. So I'm actually going to drop the default current health of the player down to let's say 10, just so that we can get hit once and test this, just to speed things up a little bit. So yeah, at this point, this is what happens. Every time we die, the game over screen gets spawned in. So let's add this Boolean here and set game over to true when this happens. And this is just going to keep track of when our player is dead and when they are not. So we also need to, just like I talked about with creating toggling UIs, we also need to check that this doesn't happen more than once. So before we set this to true, let's add a branch here and say that this can only happen when it's false. And just as a fail-safe here, we're going to grab this game over Boolean, and we're going to set it at begin play. We're going to set it to false because we know that every time we start the game is not over. So that is how we're going to control what you saw happen here was if I continued to stand in the fire, it spawned another instance of the game over screen over it, and the screen got a little bit darker. Of course, we need to hook up the Boolean here in order to make this function at all. So now if I step into the fire, the screen will not continue to darken over time as I stand here. Okay, the other thing I want to address before we actually get to the player input of the Y key and the N key is that at the moment when we die, we can still control our character, so our death isn't very meaningful here. So we need a way to stop the input here into our character. And the way we're going to do that is by using something called cinematic mode. This is most often used for creating in-game cutscenes when you want the player input to temporarily stop for the purposes of creating a small cutscene or something like that. This is what this node is typically used for, but you can use it obviously for other things. So the first thing we need to do is get a reference to the player controller. Now this is different than the player character. The player controller is what is actually handling the input when we press keys, and because of the way we use a template and the way this third person character is set up, this third person character is automatically set up with a controller already. So when we use this node for get player controller within our character, it's just going to get the controller that this character is using. So off of the return value, let's type in set cinematic mode, which will give you this node here. We got to connect the execution pins, of course. So in here we get a few Boolean options. We want is basically to set or unset the cinematic mode. We want to check this button for true. So we want cinematic mode to be true here, and everything that comes down here is basically driven by this value. So hide player, this will obviously hide our player from our scene when this is triggered. So to show you what that looks like, let's step back into the fire here, and you see that our player is gone. I can still move around though, and I can still turn, which is not what we want, and we get a bunch of errors when we see that because we're trying to move around a player that basically doesn't exist. So we're just going to hit effects movement and effects turning. Right, okay. Just checking my, just checking these errors here. Make sure there's nothing unexpected. Let's try this one more time. Okay, and you'll see that if we try this one more time with the effects movement and effect turning enabled here, we don't get those errors when we exit out of the game. So this is basically disabling our player character. But we do want to add some functionality in for restarting versus quitting the game, because right now if I press Y or N on my keyboard, nothing is happening. So let's go ahead and add that in, and it's pretty straightforward the way we do this. The same way we were binding keys to debug certain elements, we're going to add keybinds just to use certain elements. So let's type in Y key here. And you'll have to search a little bit for it, unfortunately. Any key. I'm looking down in these keyboard events. And there's Y. Okay. So once you have the Y key, we can hook up the restart to this. Now, we're not just going to do this straight. We're going to make sure that the game over screen is present first, which is another reason to use this Boolean value here, because if we just connected this to this, when we played, if we hit Y at any point, we would restart the game even if we did not have a game over. So we don't want that. So let's protect ourselves from that by using this Boolean value here. So I'm going to hold B and click to add a branch. And I'm only going to restart if game over is true, which is only being set to true when we have our player death event at the moment. Okay, and we can leave the tutorial temple in here as well. Just make sure that this name matches your level name exactly. So similar to the restart, I should say, we need a functionality for if we want to quit. So we're going to use the N key for that. And we'll have to search a little bit for this one as well. This is why I use things like Q and X and Z for debugging, because I don't have to filter through so many search results. And key there. We need to check if this is true as well here. So let's go ahead and add this branch, and I can just use this same variable here. And instead of opening the level by name, all we want to do if we press N is to quit the game. So just type in quit and do quit game. We don't have a specific player because this is a single player game, so we can just leave everything else as it is. Let's compile and save, and let's test this out. Okay, game over, restart. I'm going to hit Y, restarts, and game over, restart, and then hit N. We exit back out to the editor. So that is exactly what we want in this case. So that is it for a simple game over screen with restart and quit functionality. When we come back, we're going to wrap up the last section on player feedback, which is going to be about adding placeholder audio into your game. So I will see you in the next video. So there actually is one small issue I forgot to address in the last video, and that is the issue of the pitfall death here. So currently, if we fall into the pit here, we just automatically respawn without hitting the game over screen. And that is because we coded our kill Z volumes, our pitfalls, in the level blueprint here, and this is currently the system we have. Now, when we hit the kill Z volume, we're just reopening the level. So it seems like you would just be able to replace this with the player death. However, there's an issue with this that I will show you. So if we coded this way, so it says, okay, when we hit this, hit the player death event, and then that will take us through this whole game over screen system that we just made. That seems like it should work. However, if you test this out, you'll notice that you cannot actually input anything, and when you exit out using the escape key, you get all sorts of errors. And that is because the kill Z volume that we use to do this, it actually it destroys this actor of our character before it can hit any of this code. So basically, it's trying to read all this code from something that no longer exists in the world. So we're actually going to have to replace our kill Z volume with something a little bit more generic in order to be able to utilize this game over screen system that we had. So I'm going to come into my level, and it's a pretty simple fix, but it's something that is easily missed, I think. So let me come in here. I'm just going to search for my kill Z volume here. We'll select it in my viewport. I'm just going to delete it. Now I'm going to get this warning that says that this volume is being referenced by the level blueprint, and if I delete it, my level blueprint will break. That's fine. You can also come in here and delete the reference to it first if you're having issues. So now at this point, if we fall into the pit, nothing will happen. We'll just hit the bottom. So we need to replace this kill Z volume with a more generic type of trigger volume. And we looked at how to add box collisions to our blueprints, but we haven't looked at how that works just in the editor itself. So I'm going to open the place actors window here, and I believe it's under volumes. There's all sorts of volumes you can add, but we're going to use this one called a trigger volume. So if you're wondering why I've been using the terms box collision and trigger volumes sort of interchangeably, it's because in the editor they're called trigger volumes, not box collisions. So I'm just going to drag one of these out into the world, and we can name it something like pitfall trigger, just to give it a little bit more meaningful of a name. And I'm going to change into a orthographic top view, and the same way we did with the kill Z volume, I'm just going to scale this so it encompasses the entirety of my level, or at least the parts that have the bottomless pits in them. So I think that should be good. Let's look at it from the side. So let's drop this down to, let's say, about there. Okay, so if we test this out, currently nothing is going to happen because we haven't told the level what to do with this volume, with this trigger volume. Because it is not a kill Z volume, it does not automatically have that player death functionality coded into it. So make sure it is selected in the outliner here and come into your level blueprint. And if we right click here, we can create a reference for it and add events for it. So we're going to add event for trigger volume 1, and we're going to drop down the collision menu, and we're going to do on actor begin overlap. So these should look very familiar to you by this point. This is the same type of node we used in all of our blueprints that had trigger volumes. So we're just going to check to see if the overlapping actor is our player, and if it is, we're going to call the player death event. So let's see if this works. And then restart, yes, that one works. Restart, no, we exit out. Okay, so that is how you fix that issue with the pitfalls using the kill Z volume. You just have to replace the kill Z volume with a generic trigger volume, and in the level blueprint, code it in this way to reuse this death event with the game over screen that we made in the last video. Okay, so that is it for that. In the next video, we will be moving on to feedback audio.